Welcome to LexisNexis Risk Solutions Facing Change series. I'm Angus Sim, and today I'm delighted to welcome Rob Donoghue. Rob is the Data Protection Officer for eShop World, and so Rob, a very warm welcome to you.
Hi Angus, thanks for having me.
So get us started, Rob. Can you tell us a little bit about eShop World?
Sure. So eShop World is a global e-commerce platform. We partner with some of the world's biggest brands to facilitate them selling online and to move into new markets that they may not have previously sold into, and we try to take away the pain and the difficulty of moving into those new markets.
One of the key value propositions of eShop World is that it enables its clients to access markets where there are complexities they may not want to address themselves. Could you explain those complexities a bit more and what those challenges are?
eShop World's vision is to be a cross-border provider and enable people to sell cross-border. It shouldn't matter from a shopper's point of view, what jurisdiction they live in. They should be able to enjoy a familiar and trustworthy experience when they shop online with their favorite brands. That could mean language localization, to make sure that we get the language correct and to make sure that it looks familiar to the shopper and it's not translated poorly and in a way that seems obvious that it's not. We haven't given it our full attention. That could be local payment options. Not all regions around the world use the major card brands. Some have very specific and bespoke payment options, and it's our job to make sure that we identify those and offer them where they're appropriate. But it could be things like the checkout, having a familiar checkout. Some jurisdictions like to have taxes and duties as a separate line item, and some jurisdictions consolidate that into a single line item. And I think being able to identify those complexities and to respond to those complexities is what eShop World tries to do.
Globalization, as you've just touched on there, and dealing with all those complexities. And then COVID-19 comes along and causes mass disruption to supply chains. How's that changing how customers come to eShop World?
We've seen growth as much as 120% year on year. And I think that's down to the fact that, consumers are forced to change the way that they operate. We operate in an agnostic model when it comes to the brands that we have. So we were able to keep lanes open, shipping lanes and logistics lanes. We were able to keep those open and to support our brands to move excess stock that they had in their stores that they weren't able to move through the traditional commerce solutions of high street and shopping malls.
And in doing that, as we touched on earlier, you take on and manage some of the risks on behalf of your clients. How do you, presumably that involves you then protecting yourself from those risks as eShop World, and therefore you probably have to invest very heavily, I imagine, in knowing your customer in order to manage that risk?
We're not a financial institution, and we're not subject to the money laundering regulations, and they're implementing regulations in the same way that certain financial institutions are. But we do have obligations because we are making cross-border trades to ensure that we comply with the sanctions regimes put in place by some of the world's international organizations and the jurisdictions that we're subject to. And if they say we're not allowed to make sales of any type, that there may not be a monetary threshold on that. If they say we're not allowed to make sales to a particular person, we need to make sure that we don't breach those. So that's where we're leveraging what LexisNexis provide. They provide us with a sanctions list and the software, and for us being able to send them a name of somebody who purchases something from us. They will then screen that name against the relevant sanctions list and send us back a probability score. We then have some processes in place to review the information that comes back to make sure that the shopper who purchases something from us is not the same person as the person who is sanctioned.
So clearly compliance is a significant challenge, especially as you manage the personal data of your customers that you sell to across different jurisdictions. Is this a challenge, or in reality, can you apply best practice globally?
Probably GDPR is probably the gold standard, and that is a standard that we are subject to, and it's a standard that we apply across our platform. But it's not the only one. Like, some jurisdictions have rules around the localization of data, making sure that data is kept in that jurisdiction, and a copy of it always remains in that jurisdiction. Some countries choose to do things like change the way that consent is obtained from an individual for the use of their personal data. Some say that you cannot use consent for a particular purpose in respect of the use of that personal data. So there's a broad range of rules and regulations that govern the use of personal data. And the challenge for an organization that operates across the world is to make sure that you have a broad enough data privacy, compliance, and risk management framework to ensure that you accommodate those variances and those nuances.
And developing that theme somewhat, we sometimes hear companies, particularly we've heard this in the UK, complaining about or identifying the challenge of sharing data between organizations and governments. That must be an even greater problem across different jurisdictions. Is that the case?
There is a framework for the sharing of data, both internally within the EU single market, and GDPR applies, and across border. GDPR does recognize a number of jurisdictions where it is possible to transfer to those jurisdictions as if it was in the EU. However, on the wider scale of it, the protection of personal data is a serious matter. Many of us enjoy it as a fundamental human right. And as a society, we need to understand and set appropriate boundaries on the use of the personal data. It's of course true that, sharing personal data and aggregating personal data, which often happens after sharing it, can provide huge benefits to societies and to individuals. But there's also huge risk that comes to that, and we don't want to surrender that ground too easily. We need to have a public discourse about the pros and the cons of the sharing and aggregating of personal data about individuals, because once the bell of laissez-faire sharing rings, it'll be impossible to unring that.
And of course, when we grapple with complex problems like this and we build out best practice in an area like managing personal data, it's very important to work collaboratively with the data industry, with governments, and even with your competitors.
When you're talking about how we can share data in an ethical and responsible way, we have to be guided by the law. That is our fundamental requirement there, and the obligation is on us to make sure that we can not only comply with that, but demonstrate that we can comply with that, because that shows our consumers and our partners that we are complying with it, and we can prove it. It's up to you as an organization and as a data controller to examine your proposed use of the personal data and to apply those principles on a risk-based approach. So from my perspective, we've got to make sure that we have a conversation about data and a conversation about ethics and ensure that they reconcile with each other.
What learnings will you take from this COVID-19 crisis in the terms of eShop World to leverage and grow your business as we trade out of, we've got a long way to go through this crisis, but what would be your kind of final comments on the crisis we're living through?
There's a decade's worth of evolution that's happened in the last 2 months in respect of the buying online, and that's the analysis that we're seeing. And as an e-commerce provider, obviously that translates into a lot of opportunity for us and for our businesses, and particularly the brands that we work with. Consumers particularly have learned the benefit of shopping online. And I don't see them going back to the high street or the shopping malls just yet. I think they're learning the benefits of shopping online. I think they'll continue to do that for some time to come.